Welcome back to Critical Connections live broadcast from San Antonio, Texas. Now, let's continue our talk on research by learning even more about SCCM's new Discovery Research Network. We're about to live broadcast the session titled International Critical Care Trials Networks, Completed and Ongoing Trials, which includes some exciting work coming out of Discovery. And now we are joined by the leaders of the network, former SCCM President Dr. Craig Coopersmith, and the chair of the Discovery Network, Dr. Gajic. They will be helping to provide insight into today's broadcast and giving us more information about the network after the session. Welcome, gentlemen. If you will, please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Gajic. I'm intensivist at Mayo Clinic, and I have a privilege to chair the Discovery during its first year now. It's my first pre-game show ever, so bear with me.
And I'm Craig Coopersmith. I'm an intensivist from Emory University. I'm a past president of SCCM. People are waving at us as they walk by because it's the pre-game show.
You guys are famous. They're very into you. I'm definitely looking forward to this talk with you guys. Plus, you'll be a lot of fun. Doctors, anything you guys want to comment on?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys. So obviously, you're both advocates of collaborative clinical trials, and you've established the Discovery Network. Can you share with us your experience of establishing this, some of the joys and some of the not so joyful moments?
Let me start. So obviously there are pains and joys. The joy of networking towards the ultimate goal of improving the care and outcome of critically ill patients across the continuum is wonderful, and joy of networking with colleagues from different professions from all around the world is even so that dumps all the struggle.
And so you're leveraging the multi-institutional aspect as well as the multi-professional aspect of SCCM, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I'll expand a little bit on what Augie said. So there, of course, is some pain. Because anytime you're talking about going to multiple institutions in multiple countries, you have different IRBs, different institutions, different ways of going about doing business, and figuring out a way to synergize and put everything together can be challenging. But the payoff is remarkable. The payoff is remarkable in two different ways. The payoff is remarkable in that ultimately it helps our patients is the bottom line. The payoff is remarkable in that you get to work with new colleagues who you've never met with different ways of thinking. And it's really emblematic of the way that SCCM works. It's the multidisciplinary, multi-professional team all coming together as one for the benefit of the patient.
That's perfect.
Exactly. Well, that being said, we look forward to hearing more thoughts from you both. And now let's turn to the ballroom as we wait for the session to begin.
Everybody ready? Okay, go ahead, Dr. Spence.
Okay. So welcome to the session. It's my privilege to welcome you to the International Critical Care Trials Networks, Completing and Ongoing Trials. As you may know, we're moving from experience-based care to evidence-based care. We're moving from local critical care to international critical care, and we therefore have a distinguished group of speakers to talk about trials networks around the world. I need to tell you that this session is being broadcast live, and also that the session has been assigned its own hashtag. So if you're tweeting, please use hashtag DiscoveryNet along with hashtag SCCMLive, and we will be taking tweeted questions at the end. Our first speaker is from the Australia-New Zealand Intensive Care Society, Rachel Park, and I want to point out that Rachel is trained as a nurse, showing that doing collaborative science requires lots of different disciplines.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I have no disclosures. What I'm going to do this morning is briefly talk to you a little bit about the Australian and New Zealand Intensive Care Society Clinical Trials Group, talk about one of the studies that we've just completed, one that we're just starting, and also, as Jonathan has asked me, to talk about the role of the nurse as a researcher in critical care trials. And so the ANZIC's Clinical Trials Group started in 1994. It was established by a group of clinician investigators, critical care trialists, and we started out small with observational studies. We were lucky that we had our Canadian colleagues to follow along behind. And we started with small observational studies, soon moving into some randomised control trials and gradually growing the business. And what we've done is, along the way, establish the network, establish the infrastructure that we require, and develop this track record of clinical trials. And moving into some quite large trials now. And so we've been able to grow the number of sites that we incorporate into our trials, as well as the number of participants. And we've just commenced recruitment into our largest study so far, an 8,000 patient study. And what we've learned along the way too is that we have to expand and diversify. And so we like to collaborate with other intensive care trials groups, such as the Canadians or the Scandinavians, incorporating other study sites outside of Australia and New Zealand. And this is essential because we're not that large down under. And so we often have trials throughout Saudi Arabia, Europe, Canada and North America to ensure that we obtain our sample size. And we also like to collaborate with other non-intensive care or critical care-based research groups. A good example of this was during the H1N1 pandemic, where we undertook some study into maternal outcomes, but we also frequently collaborate with our infectious diseases colleagues as well. Our membership is our member intensive care units throughout Australia and New Zealand. Currently there's 76 member units, representing almost all the intensive cares. So what have we done since 1994? We've so far randomised over 47,000 patients into our clinical trials, received over 110 million, this is Australian dollars, in research funding, most of it from the governments of Australia or New Zealand. Published now over 12 papers in the New England, which we're quite proud of. And we count over 700 clinicians and researchers within our network. And currently we have about 39 active studies on our books. So what do we see as the three secret ingredients really to our success? Basically the science, the organisation and the passion of the people. So we meet formally in sort of scientific sessions twice a year, and I'll talk about those briefly in a minute, once in summer and once in winter. And just as importantly, and often possibly more productively, we often meet informally at the bar afterwards. In many a study, the initial study design is done on the back of a cocktail napkin and the sample size is calculated in the evening. We also believe quite strongly in some formal training for our investigators and collaborators and have designed programs to assist with that. And we believe strongly in programs of research, and the couple of examples of trials I'll give you will demonstrate that. We have quite a rigorous formal endorsement process for projects that are endorsed by the CTG. And this assesses not just the science, but also the feasibility at a local site level. So this is where I'll be next week, this time next week. This is Noosa in Queensland, and this is where we hold our 3-day scientific meeting. Our guest of honour this year is Dr. Perrin Cobb. He'll be joining us. We have a 3-day meeting. We also incorporate a meeting for our paediatric study group and a 1-day workshop for our research coordinators. We also host a research forum in winter. Sydney doesn't often get snow in winter, as this picture would make you believe, but this year it is being held in Sydney in conjunction with the Hypothermia and Temperature Management Symposium. The CTG is led by the Executive Committee, which has representatives from throughout Australia, New Zealand, as well as other groups such as the Paediatric Group, the Research Coordinator Group, and our trainees as well. Incredibly importantly, we have the support of around about 130 research coordinators throughout Australia and New Zealand, most of whom have been critical care nurses or still are. And these are the people who really do the heavy lifting and actually ensure that the trials get done. So the group totally believes in hard work and collegiality, and that's really the key to all of this. But we also like to have fun, we like to get together as well, and It really is this sort of herd mentality that I'll do your study if you do mine, and we'll get the work done in the end. So I'll talk briefly just about one of our studies that has just completed, and this is the Target study. A good example of a program of research that's been led by the co-chief investigators, Sandy Peake and Marianne Chapman from Adelaide. This has been supported by the NHMRC in Australia and the Health Research Council of New Zealand. And this program started out with an observational study, continued through a feasibility study, and ended in the phase 3 randomised control trial. And the observational study was undertaken as part of our network's point prevalence program, one-day point prevalence program, and that helped us establish what usual care was. And we discovered that just over 50% of patients in Australia and New Zealand were fed with 1 kilocalorie per mil feed, and so this established what the usual care in the feasibility study would be. The feasibility study was undertaken a year or so later, 112 patients in 5 centres, and allowed us to not only determine that we could achieve treatment separation, but allowed us to assess our recruitment rate, what our baseline mortality was for our primary outcome, and also enable us to test the blinding and delivery of the study drugs or feeds. And so leading into the Target study. So this was a 4,000 patient multi-centre double-blind randomised controlled trial, phase 3, to determine if augmented calorie delivery using this energy-dense 1.5 kilocalorie per mil feed in mechanically ventilated patients would improve 90-day survival. So patients were randomised 1-to-1 to either the 1 kcal feed or the 1.5 kcal feed, and they were fed at 1 ml per kilo of ideal body weight. And importantly, the feeding protocol was just as per local unit protocol, so no great changes there. Patients were fed up to day 28 if they were still in the ICU at that point, and had outcomes assessed up to 6 months. So the results, I know you're all dying for this, but you will have to wait. And I'm just about to explain to you why. So when we started this study back in March of last year, we thought that recruitment would take us through until about May next year. And as I said, we'd base this on the recruitment rate that we had in our phase 2 study. So we thought finishing next year, publication end of next year. However, a funny thing happened, and we actually completed the trial, enrolling 4,000 patients in November last year. 90-day follow-up has just been completed in the last week or so, and so hopefully publication of results will occur in October this year in conjunction with the European meeting. So recruitment was quite phenomenal. It was a juggernaut, this study. And so some of the numbers, we recruited on average around 8 patients a day, but on one day in particular, I don't quite know what happened, but there was 25 patients enrolled, and something like just almost 200 shipments of study feed to sites. So a huge effort from everyone. The investigators are now planning a protein study along very similar lines. So the next study that we're about to start, and this is another example of our program of research, is the TAME cardiac arrest study. And this is being led by Glenn Eastwood, who's a nurse and the research manager at the Austin Hospital in Melbourne. We all know that cardiac arrest is a common and catastrophic event with huge human and financial costs, but that often the cause of death, if patients survive to ICU, is actually brain injury. We also know that carbon dioxide is a major determinant of cerebral blood flow, and it's also a very modifiable part of patient care. Now, this program of research has started with an observational cohort study, which showed that when compared with normocapnia, hypocapnia was associated with worse outcomes, and that hypercapnia was actually associated with a greater likelihood of discharge home for ICU survivors. The investigators then undertook a prospective double crossover study, which showed quite nicely that every time the CO2 went up, the cerebral oxygenation levels also went up. We then undertook an 86-patient phase 2 study, randomised control trial, which determined biological plausibility, efficacy, feasibility and safety of this intervention. And so now to the TAME cardiac arrest trial, which has been funded from Ireland and Australia, and hopefully soon from New Zealand, which is a phase 3 randomised controlled trial enrolling 1,700 resuscitated out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients. And quite simply, they're randomised to either therapeutic normothermia or therapeutic mild hypercapnia. And this is a simple, easy bedside intervention. It has absolutely no cost, so interesting intervention. The primary outcome will be the proportion of patients with a favourable neurological outcome at 6 months, as assessed by the Glasgow Outcome Scale Extended of greater than or equal to 5. And this is a truly global study. It involves sites everywhere, pretty much. If anyone's keen to come on board, Glenn would love to hear from you. It's also been unique in that there are 2 trials playing in the same space with cardiac arrest patients, both just starting up, and that's TAME and the TTM2 trial. And while this could be quite challenging, there's cardiac arrest patients aren't really a dime a dozen, but it also gives us a unique opportunity to be able to harmonise many points of the 2 trials, including study population assessments, data safety monitoring committees and the like. So Jonathan also asked me to talk about the role of the nurse as leader in critical care trials, and I think we're incredibly lucky that we have some phenomenal examples of nurse researchers in critical care around the world. Nurses intuitively ask questions. I think most doctors will tell us that. But we like to know why things work, we like to know why things didn't work and try and replicate those situations and make them work the next time. We also, I think, get quite frustrated by the systems that we work in, that we see as restricting our ideal practice and want to try and fix these systems. And I think nurses are able to approach not just clinicians, but also the patients and their families on a very different level as they bring with them a different worldview. So I think we're incredibly lucky to have these people developing their own programs of research as well. And with that, I thank you.
So we will take questions at the end, and again, we'll be taking some Twitter questions. One of the benefits of doing critical care research is that it takes a group of people, and our next speaker, Dr. Massimo Antonelli, will be talking about the SCCM clinical trials.
This is the order.
Yes.
They changed the order. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. I do think that the phenomenal power of the NSIC is unsurpassable. And indeed, the number of studies that they are capable to do are fantastic. On the other hand, I do believe that the societies, the scientific societies, do have also another responsibility, which is very important, just to test how the things go in the real life. And for these things, at times, having the surveys or observational studies may give us a picture that well depicts how the things go. Let's go in the immediate res. I just show you a number of trials that we are launching just to give you some spots of what is going on within the society. We do have a trial on the high-dose vitamin D or on 20-day mortality in adult critical care patients where the severe vitamin D deficiency is the essence. And this is a multi-center placebo-controlled double-blind randomized trial. And the update 21 January, and for the moment we are still enrolling more centers. Then we have the decubitus, and this is an international one-day prevalence study. One of the study was alluding to, just in order to set up the pressure sore in intensive care units, and the objective is just to have a clear update with a global international perspective, a picture regarding the pressure ulcers that may occur in our patient in the ICU. And the registration centers is open, and for the moment we do have more than 700 sites. Then we have the Privaki that is addressing the implementation of the DIGO guidelines, looking at biomarkers in order to identify the occurrence of AIKI into the patients after cardiac surgery. Or the Synapsis ICU study, which is an international perspective observational study on the intracranial pressure in intensive care. And they are newly incorporated in the trial group, and now we have more than 200 that have filled up the expression of interest, and the study is being to be launched officially. And the PI is Giuseppe Citterio, who's going to be the next editor-in-chief of the Intensive Care Medicine Journal, which is our official organ. Then we have another kind of study. WindSafe is an important example. You may remember that recently the European Society, a trial group, produced a paper published into the JAMA on the epidemiology, patterns, care, and mortality in patients with ARDS. And surprisingly, we could just identify the fact that we as clinicians are often unable to identify promptly the diagnosis of ARDS, excuse me, especially when we are addressing a milder form. So from this large and huge collaborative study, which is basically an observational one, the WindSafe has been launched with the intention to just see how we wean patients from the mechanical ventilator, and now we have more than 1,000 investigators, and the data collection window of 3-week period has been extended recently up to the end of May of this year. And the Giacomo Bellani was the PI also of the previous study, is still the PI also of this new one. And the TRAIN, we have the transfusion strategies in acute brain injured patients, which is indeed a prospective multi-center randomized interventional study. And we have some preliminary results at the interim analysis that should be scheduled after 200 patients. And as you can see from the slides, we have 43 centers that are just filling up the ECRF. And there are also 11 countries that are coming from all over the world, and newly opening centers in Switzerland, Netherlands, and Denmark. For the moment, something like 1,500 patients have been enrolled and have been screened, and 193 patients have been eventually randomized. Large part of them, they had traumatic brain injury or subarachnoidal hemorrhage. Then, one thing that is just intriguing we as a society is the use of the conservative versus conventional oxygen administration in critically ill patients. In this sense, we are launching a multi-center randomized open-label trial that was inspired by the previous study that we conducted in Italy, and where we could detect that just giving conservatively the oxygen therapy to the patients, keeping the oxygen saturation between 94 and 98 was indeed much better than keeping between 97 and 100. And this study was interestingly a study, sorry, I missed the proper slide, but where the mortality rate of the patients who were receiving the conservative approach was lower than the patients who received the more liberal administration of oxygen, reducing also the number of infectious complications. Then there are some trials that has been recently closed. The abscesses, that is abdominal sepsis study, and preliminary data will be presented during the SCCM meeting next March in Brussels. Then we have the PEACE, the prevalence of acute and chronic kidney disease. I will show you some preliminary data. And the Supernova trial, which is a pilot trial. It's just a feasibility study, but it's giving us interesting results. And we are ready to launch the extended version of this trial in a randomized control settings. The baseline characteristic of the PEACE study involved almost 2,000 patients, which were characterized by a quite balanced distribution of the different level of creatinine and comorbidities. And interestingly, you can see that in this trial, the modality of the RRT way to approach these patients with acute renal failure was in large part represented by the CVVHD infiltration in reason of 40% of the entire population. But this is, again, a very preliminary study. On the other hand, the Supernova trial has been concluded. It was a feasibility study, a pilot study, and I think that it's giving us interesting results. This is a study that wants to address the strategy of ultra-protective lung ventilation combined with extracorporeal CO2 removal for the new onset moderate to severe DS. Interestingly, one of the most important results was that combining these two approaches and keeping the tidal volume below, even below 4 milliliters for an ideal body weight, the delta pressure, the driving pressure, dropped and decreased dramatically, having at the end a survival rate. Now, I remind you that this is just a feasibility study that was remarkable, 73%. I think that these opened the way to the new randomized and large trial that the European Society of Intensive Care Medicine has the intention to promote and financially support. We have a number of publications that regards the APRONET, that was the trial conducted by Claude Guérin on the proning. The lung safe, I had already alluded to that. The IC glossary that was concentrated on the global study of severe RDS infections. The IMPRESS, that is international multi-center prevalence study on sepsis, the Phoenicia study that regarded the approach of the volume replacement therapy, and the uses on the European surgical outcome studies. We have also a number of surveys that we are recently endorsed, the ISOREA, admittance, change it, and so on, that regarding various aspects of the intensive care medicine life. And other projects that for the moment are just at a very preliminary phase, and some of them are, I do believe, can be quite interesting. Just to promote this activity and just encourage the youngers to propose their own projects, we have a specific section of our meeting dedicated to the awards, and there is a platform for just propose the application that for this year has been open on February 2018. And we have also to stress that during the previous years, this award has given very good results with a number of publications in our journals and in other prestigious journals. Many apps are presented to the various congress, and many others are just again proposed. I want to conclude just to give my personal perspective, which is in large part also the perspective of the society. Our European society is indeed very committed to promote research, and this is for us one of our most important assets. But one of the essential elements remains the international cooperation that allows better achievement. And as I mentioned at the beginning, besides well-conceived randomized trial, there are surveys that are important to offer the global picture of the real life. Finally, I would say that a limpid example of collaboration has been done by the collaboration between the SCCM and the European Society for the Surviving Sepsis campaign story that should be, in my opinion, an inspiring principle for a stronger and more active collaboration for research between our societies. Thank you for your attention.
So again, we'll be taking questions at the end of the session after the next two speakers. Massimo, thank you so much for describing well what a society-based research network can do, which is a nice introduction to our next speaker, Michelle Gong, who's going to talk about SCCM's Discovery Network. Michelle?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for this opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit today about some of the studies that are ongoing and about to start at the Discovery, the Critical Care Research Network. Okay. So, oops. Okay. So I have no disclosures. So some of you may not have heard much about the Discovery Network, but that's partly because, actually, this is a relatively new entity, especially compared to the Canadian Critical Care Trials Group, ANSICS, and the SCCM. The development of the Discovery Network was first actually introduced in the January 2017 annual Congress meeting in Hawaii. And it represents a partnership between two already successful critical care research groups, the United States Critical Illness and Injury Trials Group, UCIT, as well as the Critical Care Pharmacotherapy Trials Network. And they partner with the Society of Critical Care Medicine with the goal to increase collaborative research to improve outcomes for critically ill and injured patients, and to use the Society of Critical Care Medicine's existing broad base of programs to disseminate practice into findings. So over the course of the next 10 minutes or so, I want to introduce you to just a nugget of taste of some of the studies that are ongoing and about to be started within the Discovery Network umbrella. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Program for Resilience and Emergency Preparedness, PrEP, led by Dr. Kaparin-Cobb. And I'll talk a bit about SAGE, which looks at moderate to severe ARDS, and then I'll move into looking at shock and sepsis, with the Volume Chaser study, as well as the Victus trial. So first, the Program for Resilience and Emergency Preparedness, PrEP, is led by Dr. Kaparin-Cobb of USC and funded by the FDA, BARDA, ASPR, and the CDC. And it addresses actually an important issue that we have come to recognize, which is our lack of ability to mobilize and do research in an emergency setting, a natural disaster, or the event of an unforeseen pandemic or a severe influenza season. And what PrEP aims to do is to develop a national network of acute and critical care research organizations of both academic and community hospitals, spanning the age groups of adults and children and across the continuum of care, from when the patient presents in the emergency department to when they may transition into hospital to the ICU and out. Now, this obviously requires a rapid communication of network, and in fact, I've demonstrated this and was presented actually yesterday with their ability to do quarterly queries to understand actually how the most recent influenza season may have stressed hospitals, ICUs, and the national health system. PrEP also aims to provide an infrastructure for prospective trials for the national health emergencies, such as I mentioned, influenza or anthrax. And this involves creating a national data coordinating centers, human subject review with local and national IRBs to allow for more rapid IRB review in this setting of an emergency, and coordination with international organizations and critical care trials group. As an example of that, it basically creates a network of networks where critical care research networks that spans both pediatric, emergency medicine, and critical care medicine network together to create 179 nodes across 8 networks across the United States, providing actually a web and an access point by which, in the case of an emergency or a pandemic, these sites could be potentially mobilized to do research in that setting. Now, one of the lessons learned from prior influenza, SARS, H1N1, and other pandemics is the concern about development of severe ARDS and the consequences of those patients. And this actually leads, to some degree, our SAGE study, Severe ARDS Generating Evidence. This is a study that's led by Dr. Raquel Bartz from Duke, Dr. Pauline Park from Michigan, Dr. Nita Kadir from UCLA, as well as myself. And this is a US multi-center observational study looking to assess the early management of moderate to severe ARDS in the United States. This includes looking at ventilator strategies and rescue modalities, the factors associated with survival or need for adjuvant therapy, and then the characteristics, management, and survival of patients that are referred to the tertiary centers within the SAGE study versus patients that may be presented primarily to that centers or to other centers. And we aim to also look at variability in the use of tidal volume, PEEP, and other ventilator strategies, and its associated mortality among patients in which the ARDS was managed on ECMO. Now, this study has actually recently concluded enrollment and is in the process of finishing their data entry. And over a 7-month period between October 2016 and April 2017, they have enrolled nearly 2,000 patients with moderate severe ARDS with a PF ratio of less than 150 from 25 participating sites that are spread out across the United States, constituting actually one of the largest cohorts of moderate severe ARDS. And they're currently actually in the midst of actually preparing their analysis and results for presentation at the ATS meeting in May. Now, the other bread and butter of what we do in the ICU, aside from treating acute respiratory failure and ARDS, is shock. And Volume Chaser is another study that has been generated and executed within the Discovery Network within this past year that looks at the practice variation in fluid administration and the use of vasopressor therapy in shock. The steering committee for this study, led by Dr. Tina Chen and myself at Montefiore and Albert Einstein, Dr. Russell Roberts at the Mass General Hospital, and Dr. Jonathan Savansky at Emory, represents a true collaboration between the U.S. Critical Illness and Injury Trials Group, as well as the Critical Care Pharmacotherapy Network. Volume Chaser aims to characterize the use of physiological measures, both static and dynamic, versus vital signs and other clinical findings to determine fluid responsiveness and vasopressor use, and determine whether the use of physiological measures is associated with decreased fluid administration and earlier use of vasopressors, and to explore using propensity score analysis whether the use of these physiological parameters is associated with resolution of organ failure and survival. Now, this is an example of actually how rapid studies within the Discovery Network can be conceived, executed, and implemented. Volume, which was originally a study looking at mostly the volume, resuscitation, and responsiveness, was first presented actually at the SCCM Annual Congress in January 2017 when the Discovery Network was announced. Within 2 months of that, we had our first webinar to invite interested sites. And 1 month of that, actually, we decided to join forces with the Critical Care Pharmacotherapy Trials Network, given their interest in use of vasopressors in shock, and it was a natural synergy. Within a few months of that, in September of 2017, we have already mobilized our sites and started data enrollment into our electronic CRFs. So that by this meeting, in January 2018, study enrollment has completed, and we have enrolled over 1,500 patients from 38 sites across the United States, including actually one site out in Jordan. You know, the FINESSE study actually showed us important information about volume, resuscitation, shock management in European sites, and this will give us another avenue of looking at that through the United States sites. And now I'm going to transition a little bit from some of these studies that we're looking at in terms of actually what the current practice is and what we're doing to our randomized controlled trials that we are right now in the midst of actually developing. So as you may know, in the last year or so, there's been a lot of attention about Dr. Merrick's study looking at hydrocortisone, vitamin C, and thiamine for the treatment of severe sepsis and septic shock. But this was not a randomized controlled trial, as you know. This was a retrospective comparison between patients that were historically not treated that way and then patients in the subsequent years who did get treatment with vitamin C, thiamine, and hydrocortisone, and compared actual mortality to predicted mortality. What is needed, however, is a randomized controlled trial. Invictus, led by Dr. Jonathan Saransky and Dr. David Wright from the Emory University, is looking at an issue of this triple therapy, vitamin C, thiamine, and steroids in sepsis. They will plan to enroll up to 2,000 adult patients. 500 patients are currently funded and will be subjected to an interim analysis to divide on subsequent enrollment. And it will include adult patients with suspected or confirmed infection and evidence of either respiratory insufficiency and failure or evidence of shock. The intervention is high-dose vitamin C, thiamine, and hydrocortisone for a 4 days period of time until death or ICU discharge, compared to placebo. And the outcome will be a ventilator and vasopressor-free days, an indication of actually resolution of their shock and organ failure, as well as actually a 30-day mortality. And this is another example of actually how rapidly trials and studies can be implemented within the Discovery Network. The original planning of the study started actually in mid-2017, so only about 6 months ago. By now at FCCM, some of the sites have already been identified and is mobilizing. And they hope to enroll actually their first patient somewhere around, first patient in July 1st of 2018. We have hope to actually complete the first 500 patients for interim analysis by August of 2019. Okay. This study, again, is led by Emory University, by Dr. Jonathan Saransky and David Wright, and as well as their data coordinating center, Johns Hopkins University. Now, I've only actually mentioned 4 of the ongoing or expected trials and studies that are coming out of the Discovery Network. But in truth, there actually are many, many more. And part of the reason, actually, the Discovery Network has been able to generate these is because, actually, they have a system in place for generating proposals, a chance to actually present at our clinical investigating meetings, which is about 3 times a year, for feedback, discussion, recruitment of interested investigators, as well as collaboration with other investigators. And we do provide seed funding to help with some of these studies to get them implemented and started. So in conclusion, if you're interested, I invite you to check out our website, as well as actually to attend the Discovery Network winter meeting, which will be today at 2 to 5 o'clock in room 301 BC in the Convention Center. Thank you.
So I hope that you've heard that there's a spirit of collaboration in doing clinical trials and clinical research networks. And in that vein, we're fortunate to have Dr. Deborah Cook stand in for one of her colleagues today and collaborate on his presentation.
Good morning, everybody. I'm here on behalf of Paul Hebert, who asked John Marshall to step in because he missed his flight, and then I'm here on behalf of John Marshall because John Marshall missed his flight. And that's all I have to say about men in research and critical care from Canada. somewhat helpfully. They offered a few suggestions, and a couple of slides are from my two cherished friends. So we've been doing clinical research in Canada for a long while, 28 years or so, but we have these criteria. It has to be rigorous, relevant, ethical, feasible, and fundable. And they're all very challenging, and as Rachel pointed out, passion has to fuel what we do. We just began organically and never had a particular organ or system that we were focusing on. And recently, when we did a re-engineering exercise, we found that a lot of the work we've done sort of has some themes, and it's been helpful to clarify those explicitly, not to say that they're directions, but just to describe what we do. So you'll see for the end-of-life care theme, that has really merged into a lot of interesting work on what is death, really, and organ donation, procurement, et cetera. So I'm just going to talk about a few examples and acknowledge the importance of harm prevention in the ICU. When we think so often we're doing things to be helpful, we increasingly are reorienting our thoughts to minimization of harm. And I'd like to begin with something that isn't a randomized trial, but is the work and of a great passion of Margaret Herridge, a treasured colleague of ours, who began doing something that was really not very popular many years ago, following patients who survived their critical illness. And the message about trying not to make things too easy is something that we always like to propagate, and trying not to make things look too easy. So Margaret's been working in this field for 25 years, and some of you will be familiar with her seminal work. But she also has grown through the trials group with her partner Jill Cameron, to realize there's not just the patient we care for, but there are family members, family however we define that, friends, neighbors, et cetera, and caseworkers sometimes. And in the genesis of a dyad of a patient and a clinician, she and Jill have gone on to recognize the profound distress of many caregivers of critically ill patients and the severe and long-lasting symptomatology that affects their life very, very profoundly. And so it is this thematic growth that we've tried to focus on. But we've also tried to understand technology beyond the basic and advanced life support technology that we're so familiar with. And this is the work of Michelle Coe. Another of our major principles, as others have spoken about, is the need to recognize and celebrate the interprofessional team, not just in the delivery of care, but in the genesis of questions and in the implementation of protocols. So this is Michelle Coe's rationale, and I know in Australia and here in the US there are probably many other folks interested in understanding the role of in-bed cycling. And Michelle Coe has developed a very nice programmatic approach to this, asking questions about the very basics of cycling and exercise, doing a pilot observational study, a pilot trial, and now she's received national funding for her international randomized trial, which is well underway with the associated knowledge translation. So this is obviously work that is going to take 2 decades or more to do, again, under the category of trying to avoid making it look too easy. Another theme that has come up many places all over the world is the importance of trying to support and encourage collaboration amongst pediatric critical care practitioners. And fortunately, the mortality rate for children obviously is less than for adults. There are fewer critically ill children than adults, also fortunate. But we're trying always to synergize with pediatric critical care practitioners. Obviously, they have their own great questions and studies, but link programs, and this slide goes beyond the single program to try to synergize among programs that are standalone programs already in Canada, and this is sort of collaborative between those folks I just mentioned. We're also trying to do more translational biology work and bench-to-bedside work, and many of you will know Laura Lynn McIntyre, a great colleague who's done this amazing work on mesenchymal stem cells and has been exposing patients with septic shock to this in preparation for a randomized clinical trial to see if stem cells make a difference to outcomes with severe sepsis. some of the recently completed work, and this is a theme in many different sectors as well, is the age of blood. Paul Hebert, Jacques Lacroix, and colleagues evaluating whether or not so-called standard issue blood or fresh blood makes a difference to outcomes in heterogeneous critically ill patients. And as you know, it does not seem to be the case with 90-day mortality, and there's a longer story there. The genome has been a hot topic, but what is also really hot in critical care now is the microbiome. And although many of the observational studies about the microbiome have been outside the critical care arena, there's an exponential growth on microbiome-relevant research in critical care. And that's been very exciting to our group in McMaster. And we've recognized there are a couple of interventions among several that influence the microbiome and cause perhaps dysbiosis or exacerbate the dysbiosis associated with critical illness. Probiotics, which have been shown to be one of the top 4 cost-effective ways of preventing pneumonia, and stress ulcer prophylaxis, which after 25, 30 years of research is largely acid suppression to most critically ill ventilated patients. And so we've decided we also want to focus on this, and we have another year to go in the enrollment of patients in our PROSPECT trial, which is evaluating the effect of probiotics on pneumonia, all kinds of infections, and C. diff, of course. You probably are aware of the hospital and outpatient literature on the salutary effects of probiotics, and we're checking that out in critical illness as well. With respect to REVISE, we're awfully excited to be collaborating with our ANZICS colleagues and hopefully others around the world in this trial, which is particularly fun for me because I began my career evaluating what was then quite a prevalent problem of upper GI bleeding that was potentially clinically important. And as you know, acid suppression has been used worldwide, but we're re-evaluating the inhibition of GI bleeding and wondering whether the widespread acid suppression in the form of H2 blockers and PPIs actually do anything at all, or whether this approach actually does more harm than good. So like most of our programs, this is actually our second whole program on stress ulcer prophylaxis, but resurrecting this, we wanted to acknowledge amazing work done by pharmacists largely in the US, surveys to demonstrate the utilization, the shift to PPIs from H2 blockers, and many, many types of sequential analyses and regular meta-analyses and network meta-analyses led by Walid Al-Hazani in our place and other colleagues in Saudi, and of course amazing friends in Denmark. So we'd hope to do an international trial, including and with the folks in Denmark, but they've finished one, and we now are embarking with the Australian, New Zealand colleagues, and hopefully more across the world to conduct REVISE to see what the effect is of withholding. The intervention is not giving something, but withholding acid suppression in mechanically ventilated critically ill patients to see what the impact is of bleeding, pneumonia, C. diff, etc. So here's the basic structure. And you know the emerging literature about AKI and PPI has caused us to be interested in this as well. Back to my comment about children. Mark Duffett, another PhD pharmacist working with us, is also leading a CHR-funded trial on this very question. So we're always trying to merge and grow. Paul left a few slides in sort of table form to show, and I'm just going to portray those to say we have about 45 studies underway, and I don't have time to present them all, but we've been very humbled to be learning all the time, especially from our colleagues internationally, and it was amazing to hear about the great synergies this morning from our panel. So thank you, Jonathan, for including me, letting me represent the trials group.
We're back at Critical Connections Live, where we just watched the speakers present a wide range of research sponsored by SCCM's Discovery Program. Joining our panel now are leaders within the Discovery Network, Dr. Craig Coopersmith and Dr. Ognjen Gajic. I'll turn things over to our guests and co-hosts to offer more insight into this session. Dr. Lin, if you'd like to begin.
Yes, that hour was incredible. all this work that was done in just 1 year. I wanted to ask you about the logistics of the Discovery Network, but maybe we could start by having you describe for us what your mission statement is.
So the mission statement really comes out to the patient-centered outcomes. So what matters in the most is what is at the bedside. So as we have seen from our international colleagues as well as Michelle for Discovery, there is a breadth of research crossing interprofessionally, across the age of the patient, across the continuum of critical care, from prevention of critical illness till long-term outcomes, all towards achieving the three critical outcomes. So preserving the quality of lives, preserve the restored quality of deaths of those who are dying, and quality of relationships involving that. As you could see, there was also follow-up on a caregiver burden and families and everything.
In a ideal scenario, how do you see the flowchart of how Discovery funds and grows a particular clinical question?
I can take this one too. So as you could see, the processes, and Michelle hinted to that, we have 3 investigator meetings around winter, spring, and a fall meeting where we have call for proposals. This is all investigator initiated. The society does not bring research. These are researchers who bring the ideas. It is submitted, goes to peer review. We provide seed funds intramural through Discovery mechanisms, $100,000 a year for a pilot study or observational study, and then we provide support, methodological support, clinical and statistical coordinating center for further submissions into larger trials that may be funded by government, NIH, and other mechanisms.
So what sort of projects are you looking for?
So
Craig, did you want to take that?
So as we discussed and we've seen from our international colleagues and from Michelle today, the research spends all to understand. Meaningful research has many facets. So have very important observational studies to find out the actual practice outliers, how we can standardize large quality improvement projects that this SCCM has pioneered with to thrive with other initiatives that are also scaled up internationally to find out in research what quality improvement strategies work the best. Obviously for things like novel hypotheses that are a little bit sexy but unproven, such as vitamins for the antioxidant for early sepsis, you need to do a rigorous clinical trial, randomized clinical trial to see the causality of that finding, and etc. So wide span.
I'll step in with 2 different things. First, you can bring it down to basically one sentence. Anything that would change the outcome, the impact upon the patient and their family. Clinical research is a very wide spectrum, and what we want to do is make sure that there's multi-center trials of every possible study design that ultimately we can say, this touches the patient, this touches the family, because that's what we care about. And just to take a step back, because I'm not sure we talked about it earlier on, the Discovery Network has over $2 million of funding from SCCM. This is, in fact, the largest financial outlay we have ever made on anything other than buying our own headquarters in Chicago. So in an organization that's over 45 years old, the single thing, the research has always been part of our strategic plan. I encourage people to go to our website and see our strategic plan. Research is front and center, and we said, how can we make a difference not in our patients' lives today, which clearly we're expert on. That's what Congress is about. That's what this is about. But how can we make a difference in our patients' lives tomorrow? And that's what Discovery is all about.
So if you're a bedside nurse or a young faculty member starting out, is this something you should be thinking about? Can you, or do you have to be a bigwig in the society to come up with an idea?
So that's a great question, and obviously the SCCM investments and the mission of Discovery Network is to increase interprofessional research. As the society is an interprofessional organization, its research network is also interprofessional organization. As you've seen from Michelle's talk, there is the volume chaser study, the study run by intensivists and by clinical pharmacists, trying to understand the approach to timing and amount of fluid and vasopressors in early shock. There is, in a steering committee of the Discovery Network, it reflects the multi-professional organization, having physicians from different disciplines, from anesthesiology, surgery, critical care, as pediatrics, as well as nurses, pharmacists, and I'm proud to say one of our steering committee members is a patient, which brings this down to what it is all about. And serendipitously, our patient has won the first grant, extramural grant on behalf of Discovery. The patient engagement working group led by Eileen Rubin has won a PCORI planning grant for quality improvement intervention to humanize ICU experience.
That's fantastic.
And it's really important to dovetail on that. You asked who can be in Discovery, and the answer is everybody. So we want the research legends like the guy sitting next to me over here. We want the people who have shovel-ready projects and have published in JAMA, like Dr. Gajic has. We also want somebody who's year one, who's just starting. We want trainees. We want people to say, I've got an idea, but I don't exactly know how to do it, or I've got it, but I need it fleshed out. You come to Discovery, you work with senior people. The whole idea is to come from idea to move it up to a higher level, go through rigorous things, work with other sites and say, I have an idea. Somebody says, well, how can we improve that? How can we improve that? And ultimately, you have 25, 100 sites in the United States and around the world. And so you get from person day one with the idea to the guy sitting next to me on the right.
I think that's fantastic. And so there's mentoring opportunities for younger people who may not have the experience of that Augie has.
While we're on the air, how do they go about finding out about this? Do you have a website URL at the ready?
Yep. So there is obviously the Discovery. There is e-community and Discovery. There is a call for obviously there is Twitter nowadays. We're trying to reach out to the membership of FCCM, and the process is relatively simple, but rigorous. So 3 times a year the investigators meetings. Up to 1 month before the investigator meeting, the call for proposal is open. It's a simple form. It doesn't have to be very well formed, the idea, but it has to be more than one center, and it has to follow the rigor of how would you submit a research proposal. It goes to peer review. If it's not perfect, it gets feedback. It gets presented in a non-threatening manner on our investigator meetings, and it increases your chance to come up with a better study, to be able to obtain either intramural seed funding from SCCM or even extramural funding.
And so while the information, of course, is on our website, and we encourage everybody to go to the URL, which I hope is flashing on the screen as I'm speaking. With these meetings, it's important. Clearly, ideally, we want people to come in person. So we have a meeting here.
Right. 2 to 5 this afternoon.
This
from
afternoon.
301.
We have a meeting at the NIH, and we also have a meeting at the American Thoracic Society. But it's important that we also have virtual. So certainly, while it's best and optimal if everybody can come in person, we understand that travel funds are tight and schedules are difficult. And because of that, we've tried to make it as widely open to the general public as possible. And so people can, I'm the tech not savvy, the equivalent of Skype in, but whatever people do in 2018 to do that.
We still have Skype.
Okay. FaceTime, WeChat. But people can come into our virtual meetings as well. So the idea is to have multiple people in the sort of big group, and then in smaller work groups that you can network, and if you can actually make it in person, that you can sort of phone in and present people. And certainly at our meetings, we have people literally who will be unable to fly in for whatever reason, and they'll be presenting their entire project to the group virtually.
I want to follow up on what you were saying earlier about how this is one of the biggest financial outlays that the SCCM has done. It sounds great. Do you have plans to try to get philanthropists to match that, to try to get more funding? Because it sounds like a great concept.
He's looking at me, so I'll start on this one. Yeah, the idea is ultimately that this is going to be financially self-sustaining. And so we're starting out with a big financial outlay for a number of different things. I'm going to start and let Augie take over in a second. So we want to have seed grants. Again, it's incredibly important that we start people along the pathway. You're not going to do a multi-center prospective randomized trial for the price of a seed grant, but you are going to be able to get enough preliminary data that you can go to a large funding agency to get the seed grants. So we start with seed grants. We start with infrastructure, with statisticians, with grant writers, with REDCap, with all types of different infrastructure we have with a clinical coordinating center. So you can do this all through SCCM if you want to. You don't have to. We offer the services. And the idea is that we're synergizing and getting people to go to a certain place, and then the ultimate metric of success will be two things: engaged people, three things: better outcomes for our patients, but then also funding. And so we're going to be going to PCORI, we're going to be going to AHRQ, we're going to be going to the NIH, we're going to be going to foundations, any place who would have an interest in critically ill and injured patients that we can improve their outcomes. The goal is that we will have this discovery stamp of success on it, that we're going to say, this is a great program, please fund it.
Yeah, I could add a few other things. So through abilities to standardize data elements, the nowadays ubiquitous introduction of electronic records, we hope to decrease the burden of participating in the clinical trials so that community hospitals and others can join. So the first thing that is critical is to provide the good so discovery methodology experts will help you come up with a proposal that is going to be fundable, that's going to be more competitive and ultimately result in a better research. So that's one, and then the funders will come. So if the idea is good, you will find the money. I don't think that's an issue. You don't want to fund something which is not good. And the second thing is we would like to encourage hospitals really across the world to understand the research and QI mission of the discovery and contribute and allow their employees, be it the staff from multidisciplinary critical care and multi-professional critical care, to participate in the research projects, even supported by the hospital itself. What they get back from it, they get a stamp that they are working with discovery, that they are contributing to science, they get their data back, the benchmarking and other things. So we are hoping to increase the awareness of the importance of patient-centered research, which should be matching the interests of everyone, the insurance companies and patients and hospitals themselves.
And it's important to mention that we're looking for exponential growth. So at that exciting session that we just saw, the ANZIS group is over 40 years old. The Canadian Trial Critical Care group is over 30 years old. The SCCM group is a number of years old. Discovery is 1 year old. And yet what you saw Michelle was presenting, numerous observational trials in 1 year, a prospective randomized trial with multi-million dollars already foundationally funded. And so if we take the successes and build on it, the future is limitless.
It sounds really exciting. This might be a redundant question, but I wanted to ask you how you plan to grow the Discovery Network further.
So as SCCM is interprofessional, it is also international organization. So we have been in talks and in partnering with several international trials network and individual hospitals to expand discovery mission. And there are some studies, as you know, one of them, we have a center in Jordan for a SAGE study. We have in a certain program, we have number of hospitals from China, India, South America, Eastern Europe, not traditionally involved in clinical research. So one is professional. The second thing is we really want to reach out to the community hospitals where majority of our critical ill patients are, and through the discovery, the international and outreach group, we have ideas of how to try to reach to really any place where the critical ill patient may be. Lastly, the critical care is across the continuum, and most of the critical illness, especially the timely preventable part, does not happen in the ICU. All our research, unfortunately, is pointing out after like 24 hours being in the ICU, when most of our patients, the trajectory is already completed. So moving into the emergency room and even into prevention of critical illness before hospital admission is one of our missions. And within the today, for example, one of the proposals is coming for the study that starts in the emergency room and is proposed by the emergency medicine physician.
And we also want to expand this to the SCCM membership. So Discovery is 1 year old. So it was announced in the podium a year ago by President Kleinfeld. President Zimmerman talked about it again. Dr. Gahn just spoke about it at the session, but a lot of people still don't know what Discovery is. We're in a toddler, infancy into toddlership perhaps, and we want people to come this afternoon. That's why we're doing this. We want more and more people to know SCCM is many, many thousands of people strong. There's a lot of people who are doing great work who don't exactly know what to do. This is a perfect place to come and join the community, to work with other people, to do the research. And so get the message out. Tell everybody, tell your friends, put the URL up on there again to get the word out to our membership.
Any other comments or questions?
I think that was a very inspiring last point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask, as the past president of SCCM, what are you looking forward to this year, 47th year?
Everything.
The man who cannot be stumped.
No, what I'm looking forward to, I'm looking forward to a year of tremendous success for the Discovery Network. I'm looking
Amazing.
forward to doing tremendous research. I'm looking forward to Augie's leadership. I'm looking forward to making a difference in the lives of our patients. I'm looking forward to doing research that we have somebody, the reason we do this is we work in the ICU, and today you have a patient in bed 1, and you do everything you can, you do everything right, and they still don't have a good outcome. I'm looking forward under his leadership and under all his colleagues to come up with answers that a year from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we're going to have some new piece of knowledge that will give that patient a better outcome. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Excellent. Perfect way to end it. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and for being part of our panel, and for also, once again, just telling us a little bit more about the Discovery Network. We are coming to a close here, and the fun is not over just yet. Join us for Critical Connections live from Congress tomorrow, where we'll be joined once again by our amazing co-hosts and special guests. First up on the agenda is Dr. Tim Buckman, as we review the session, Bioelectronic Medicine, a Jumpstart in Critical Illness. Later in the day, we will live broadcast the session on controversies in early detection and treatment of sepsis, where we'll be joined by nurse Krista Shore, who will share her expertise within the Surviving Sepsis campaign. We also will have a special discussion tomorrow here at the live desk with members of the Surviving Sepsis Campaign Collaborative. If you're wondering what the collaborative model is or how you can improve in the early identification of sepsis, you'll want to join us tomorrow for an engaging discussion on practicing ways to better care in the ICU.